In 1995, a 7-year-old girl named Sofia Ramirez vanished while playing beside her mother at a bowling alley. The police called it a probable stranger abduction after she wandered outside. For 5 years, that lie was the only story. Then a plumber fixing a leak unearthed a secret so horrifying, it would change everything. Before I begin, thank you for watching. Let me know in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it there? It really means a lot to know you're here with us. We're in this together. Now, let me tell you what really happened. The universe of a 7-year-old is small and intensely bright. For Sofia Ramirez, that universe smelled of floor wax, stale popcorn, and the sweet, electric tang of a cherry slushie. Its capital city was Henderson's Lanes, a sprawling brick building where the thunder of falling pins was the national anthem and the glow of the arcade was the eternal sunrise. On a Saturday afternoon in October of 1995, Sofia was a queen in her kingdom. Her mother, Elena, watched her, a smile playing on her lips. At 29, Elena's life was a carefully balanced equation of double shifts at the diner, PDA meetings, and these precious, stolen hours with her daughter. She was a single mother, a fact her own parents still lamented, but Elena saw no deficit in their life. What they lacked in money or a father figure, they made up for with a fierce, protective love that was its own kind of wealth. Every giggle from Sofia, every squeeze of her small hand, was a deposit in an account that could never be overdrawn. "Watch this, Mommy," Sofia shouted, her voice cutting through the din. She heaved the small, 6-pound bowling ball with all her might. It wobbled, veered dangerously toward the gutter, then seemed to correct itself by sheer force of will, trundling down the lane to knock over a heroic 3 pins. Sofia threw her arms up in triumph, her pigtails bouncing. "I'm a champion. You are mi amor," Elena laughed, walking back to the ball return. The champion of the whole world. This was their ritual. 2 games every other Saturday, followed by a shared plate of greasy fries and the slushy Sofia coveted like treasure. Henderson's Lanes was their place. It felt safe, a relic from a simpler time, run by a man who seemed to be a part of the town's foundation. Mr. Arthur Henderson was a figure as constant as the seasons. An elderly man with a cloud of white hair and eyes that crinkled at the corners. He moved through his domain with a gentle, shuffling grace. He knew every regular's name, always had a piece of hard candy for the kids, and ran the cleanest, most family-friendly establishment in the county. He was a beloved institution. As Elena bowled her final frame, she saw Mr. Henderson standing near the arcade, watching the kids play. He was smiling his usual benevolent smile, but as his gaze drifted from the flashing lights of the games and settled on Sofia, who was now dancing by the ball return, the smile faltered for a fraction of a second. The warmth in his eyes was replaced by something else, something deeper and colder, a flicker of profound, ancient sorrow that was almost immediately masked again by his public face. Elena registered it subconsciously, the way an animal senses a shift in the air before a storm, but dismissed it just as quickly. He was an old man. Old men were often lost in their memories. "Okay, little champion," Elena said, ruffling Sofia's hair. "Time to pay up and head home. You have homework, remember?" "Aw," Sofia groaned, but the complaint was half-hearted. The cherry slushie, held carefully in both hands, was her prize. She took a long, noisy sip as they walked toward the front counter. The air was thick with the cacophony of a busy bowling alley, the sharp crack of a perfect strike from lane 12, the rumble of a ball rolling down the wood, the chaotic symphony of bells and buzzers from the arcade, and the low hum of conversation from the adults in the lounge. It was the sound of community, of normalcy, of safety. They reached the counter, a long Formica island presided over by a lanky, bored-looking teenager with a shock of dyed green hair. Sofia stood right beside Elena, her hip pressed against her mother's leg, her attention focused entirely on the icy red concoction in her hands. "That'll be $12.50, ma'am," the teenager said, not looking up from his magazine. Elena turned her body slightly, shifting her purse from her shoulder to get her wallet. Her back was to Sofia for no more than 10 seconds. In that brief window, she pulled out a 10 and a 5, placed them on the counter, and waited for her change. It was a moment of mundane transaction, identical to 1,000 others she had performed in her life. It was the moment the world ended. She turned back, change in hand. "Ready to go, Sophie?" Silence. The space where her daughter had been standing was empty. Elena's eyes scanned the immediate area, a flicker of annoyance her first reaction. Sophia? No hiding. Nothing. Her gaze dropped to the floor. There, by her feet, was the slushy cup, lying on its side. A brilliant, blood-red stain was spreading across the worn, checkered linoleum, a vibrant splash of violence in the muted colors of the bowling alley. A cold dread, sharp and immediate, pierced through Elena. "Sophia?" Her voice was louder now, tight with a rising panic. She looked at the teenage employee. "Did you see where she went?" "My daughter." The boy finally looked up, his expression blank. "Oh no. Sorry." Elena's head whipped around. Her eyes darted over the crowd, searching for a flash of Sophia's bright pink jacket. She scanned the arcade, the shoe rental, the entrance to the lounge. The noise of the alley, once a comforting blanket of sound, now felt menacing, a wall of noise that could swallow a child whole. "Sophia!" she screamed, her voice a raw, ragged thing that cut through the din. A few heads turned. The illusion of safety shattered into a million pieces. She was gone. She was just here. Now she was gone. Elena lunged toward the front doors, her heart hammering against her ribs. She shoved them open, her eyes frantically searching the twilight of the parking lot. Cars, asphalt, the darkening sky. No little girl in a pink jacket. She ran back inside, her breath coming in choked sobs. She grabbed the teenager's arm, her grip desperate. "Call 911, she whispered, the words catching in her throat. Somebody took her. She was right here. The long, silent nightmare had just begun. The first police car arrived in 7 minutes, its flashing lights painting the front of Henderson's lanes in frantic strokes of red and blue. The initial response was textbook. Officers fanned out, securing the building, and a calm, uniformed patrolman took Elena's initial statement. But as the investigation shifted from a missing child alert to a formal case, the calm evaporated, replaced by a creeping, insidious doubt directed not at the circumstances, but at Elena herself. The lead detective assigned to the case was a man named Miller, a 20-year veteran with a weary face and eyes that seemed to have seen every form of human failure. He led Elena to a small, cluttered back office, away from the prying eyes of the other patrons. His questions started simply. Sophia's full name, her age, what she was wearing, but soon took on a subtle, accusatory edge. "You say you only turned your back for a few seconds, Mrs. Ramirez?" he asked, his pen poised over his notepad. 10 seconds. Maybe 15. I was paying, Elena said, her voice shaking. She was wrapped in a coarse wool blanket an officer had given her, but a deep, internal cold had taken root that no blanket could touch. "And you didn't see anyone suspicious near the counter?" "No, it was crowded. Noisy. I was looking at the cashier." Miller made a note. "It's a big, loud place. Lots of doors. Easy for a curious kid to slip out into the parking lot without anyone noticing." "No," Elena insisted, shaking her head vehemently. "She wouldn't do that. Sophia knows never to go into a parking lot alone. She was right next to me. Someone took her from inside the building." The detective gave her a patient, placating look, the kind one gives a hysterical person. "We have officers searching the entire area, ma'am. The parking lot, the woods behind the building, the adjacent streets. If she wandered off, we'll find her." The focus of the investigation was immediately external. The police operated on the assumption that Sophia had exited the building. The possibility that she was still inside, that the threat was internal, was dismissed almost out of hand. The bowling alley was a known quantity, a family place. Mr. Henderson was a pillar of the community. The narrative was simpler, more palatable, if the danger came from the outside world. Mr. Henderson himself was the picture of a devastated and helpful witness. He unlocked every door for the officers, his hands trembling theatrically. He expressed his profound shock and sorrow to Detective Miller. "I've owned this alley for 40 years, he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Nothing like this has ever happened. My heart breaks for that poor woman." When Miller asked about security tapes, Henderson's face fell. "The system is old, Detective. It's been acting up for weeks. I've been meaning to get it replaced." He led them to a small closet where a VCR was connected to a single black and white monitor. He pressed play. The footage showed the front counter, but it was clearly on a loop. The same woman in a floral dress walked past every 30 seconds. The timestamp in the corner was frozen at an hour before Sofia had even vanished. "I'm so sorry," Henderson said, shaking his head. "It seems to be stuck. It's useless." Miller sighed, accepting the explanation without question. Technology failed. It happened. The investigation's bias became clearer as the hours wore on. They questioned Elena about her ex-husband, about boyfriends, about anyone who might hold a grudge against her. The implication was clear: a single Hispanic mother, working long hours. Perhaps her life wasn't as stable as she claimed. Perhaps the problem originated with her. Her grief and terror were filtered through their preconceived notions, and she was subtly repositioned from a victim to a person of interest in her own daughter's disappearance. Her powerlessness was a physical weight. She watched as the police wrapped up their search of the building after less than an hour. Satisfied she wasn't there, they dusted the front door for fingerprints. They interviewed a dozen patrons who all said the same thing. They hadn't seen anything. Elena's desperate pleas to search the building more thoroughly, to check the storerooms again, to question Mr. Henderson more closely, were met with weary sighs and promises that they were following standard procedure. In the days that followed, the official narrative solidified. With no witnesses and no ransom call, the police settled on the theory of a probable stranger abduction. They announced it at a press conference, with Mr. Henderson standing grimly beside the chief of police. The story was that Sofia had most likely wandered out of the front door and been snatched from the parking lot. The focus of the search shifted to a multi-state alert for a non-existent predator in a non-existent car. Elena's rage was a silent, screaming thing. They were assassinating her daughter's memory, painting her as a careless child who had disobeyed her mother, and by extension, painting Elena as a negligent parent. 2 days after the disappearance, Mr. Henderson gave a tearful interview to the local news, standing in front of his bowling alley. He announced a $5,000 reward for any information leading to Sofia's return. He looked directly into the camera, his eyes welling with tears. "We are a community," he said. "We look after our own. We will find this little girl." That night, long after the news crews had left and the bowling alley was dark and silent, Henderson walked through his quiet kingdom. He went into his office and locked the door. He moved a heavy, 4-drawer filing cabinet away from the wall, revealing the faint outline of a door. He knelt, his knees cracking, and produced a small key. He unlocked a deadbolt that was invisible from the outside. He pulled the section of wall open, revealing a small, dark, soundproofed room. The only light came from the hallway behind him. Inside, a small girl was asleep on a cot, clutching a worn stuffed bear. Henderson stepped inside, his shadow falling over her. He calmly wiped the interior handle of the hidden door with a cloth, the sharp, clean scent of bleach momentarily overwhelming the smell of stale air. He looked at the sleeping child, then at a faded photograph of his own daughter that sat on his desk, her smile frozen in time. His face was a mask of placid, unreadable grief. A week after Sofia vanished, Detective Miller called Elena at home. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Ramirez," he said, his voice flat and professional. "We've exhausted all leads in the area. The Amber Alert will remain active, and the file will stay open, of course. But at this point, there's not much more we can do." The line went quiet. Elena slowly hung up the phone. She looked at the wall of her living room, which she had covered in missing posters bearing Sofia's smiling 7-year-old face. The official search was over. The system had failed. For the first time, she truly understood the terrifying, absolute nature of her new reality. No one was coming to help. She was alone with the ghost of her daughter. Time is a cruel thief. For most people, It moves forward, healing wounds and dulling sharp edges of pain. For Elena Ramirez, time stopped on October 14th, 1995, and became a flat, endless circle of grief. The world moved on, but she was trapped in the amber of that Saturday afternoon, forever turning her back for 10 seconds. The first year was a blur of frantic action. She organized search parties, hounded the police, and plastered every telephone pole, storefront, and bus stop in a 50-mile radius with Sofia's face. But leads dried up, volunteers stopped showing up, and the police stopped returning her calls. The town's sympathy curdled into a weary pity. She became a landmark of local tragedy, that poor woman whose daughter vanished at the bowling alley. By the third year, her fight had changed. The frantic energy had cooled into a hard, obsessive resolve. She realized the police were not her allies. They were an obstacle. She had to become her own detective. She quit her second job at the diner, surviving on the single shift at the cafe, pouring every spare dollar and every waking hour into her own investigation. Her small apartment became a meticulously organized command center. The walls of her living room were no longer just a collage of missing posters. They were covered in maps, timelines, and photographs. She had a map of the bowling alley's layout, painstakingly recreated from memory. She had a list of every employee who had worked there in 1995. She spent her nights at the public library, scrolling through years of microfiche, reading old newspapers and town records. She was searching for a pattern, a crack, anything that the police had missed. She was looking for information on Arthur Henderson. She learned he had a daughter, Emily, who had died tragically some 20 years prior. A car accident. She was 7 years old. The detail struck Elena with the force of a physical blow. She found Emily's obituary, a short, sad paragraph in the local paper. She found a high school yearbook photo of Henderson, a young man with the same sad eyes. He had been a quiet, unassuming man his whole life, until he inherited the bowling alley from his father. He was a man defined by a single, shattering loss. One afternoon, Elena drove to a gas station on the outskirts of town. Behind the counter was a man in his early 20s, his hair now a faded, muddy brown, but she recognized him instantly. It was the teenage cashier from that day. She walked up to the counter, her heart pounding. "I remember you," she said, her voice low and steady. "You were working at Henderson's Lanes the day my daughter disappeared." The young man, whose name was Kevin, froze. The color drained from his face. "Yeah," he stammered, refusing to meet her eyes. I talked to the cops. I told them everything I knew." "I don't think you did," Elena pressed, leaning closer. "I've spent 5 years replaying every second of my mind. While I was getting my wallet, I was watching you in the reflection of the gumball machine. I saw Mr. Henderson come up to the counter. He spoke to you." She paused, her eyes locking onto his. "What did he say to you, Kevin? What did he do to make you turn your head right at that moment?" Kevin's eyes were wide with panic. He remembered the crisp $50 bill Henderson had folded into his hand, the quiet instruction to go deal with the stock in the back. He remembered thinking the old man was just being nice. I don't know what you're talking about." "He needed a distraction," Elena said, her voice ablaze. "And you gave it to him." The accusation, unspecific but piercingly accurate in its intent, hit its mark. A flicker of terror, real and profound, crossed his face. "You're crazy," he whispered, backing away from the counter. He turned and fled into the back office, leaving Elena standing alone by the register. It wasn't a confession, but it was confirmation. Henderson had engineered the opportunity. Meanwhile, in the small, silent world behind the wall, Sofia Ramirez turned 8, then 9, then 10. Her world was a 10 by 10-foot room, its walls padded with gray acoustic foam, its only light a single, bare bulb on the ceiling that was on for 12 hours a day. The only sound from the outside world was the distant, muffled thunder of bowling balls and the faint cheer of a strike, sounds that meant nothing to her. Her memories of her mother, of the sun, of the color green, had faded like old photographs, bleached out by the relentless monotony of her existence. Her only human contact was a man she called Mr. Eddie. He was the hand that pushed a tray through a small slot in the door 3 times a day. He never spoke to her from outside the room. But once a night, he would come inside. He would sit on the edge of her small cot, his large frame filling the tiny space. He would bring her a new book or a small toy. He would read to her in a low, gentle voice. He never raised his voice. He never touched her. He was her teacher, her warden, her God. He was the only person in the world. His routine was chillingly paternal. Every night, without fail, the dinner tray held a plain turkey sandwich on white bread, a small carton of milk, and a cherry slushie, which he made himself in a small machine in his office. It was the last thing his own daughter, Emily, had eaten. In his fractured mind, this ritual was an act of love, a way of preserving the perfect, final moment of his own daughter's life, now projected onto the captive child who wore her face. Sofia, who had no memory of why the flavor was significant, simply accepted it. It was just dinner. On the 5th anniversary of Sofia's disappearance, Elena performed her lonely ritual. She drove to Henderson's Lanes and parked across the street, watching as the big neon signs sputtered to life against the bruised purple sky. She watched families go in and out, their laughter a faint, painful echo of a life she once had. Hope had long since withered into a cold, hard knot of certainty in her gut. She knew Henderson had taken her. She knew Sofia was gone forever. She accepted the silence, the not knowing, as her life sentence. She didn't know that deep inside the walls of the building, a copper pipe installed in 1952 was groaning under the pressure of 5 decades. A small, green line of corrosion had been eating away at its integrity for years. As Elena watched the bowling alley, her heart a hollow ache in her chest, that tiny flaw finally gave way. With a soft metallic sigh, the pipe split open, releasing a trickle of water into the dark, forgotten space between the walls. The silence was about to be broken. The first sign of the impending disaster was a smell. For 2 days, a faint, musty odor like old, damp earth had been seeping into Mr. Henderson's office. He tried to ignore it, blaming the old building's quirks. But on the 3rd day, he saw it. A dark, ugly stain, the size of a dinner plate, blooming on the floral wallpaper behind his desk. It was the wall, the wrong wall. A cold, electric panic shot through him. He ran his trembling hand over the spot. It was damp and cool to the touch. The leak was inside the cavity, the secret space that separated his office from the cell, where he kept Sofia. For 5 years, his sanctuary had been perfect, impenetrable. Now, the building itself was betraying him. The stain grew with alarming speed. By the next morning, it had doubled in size, and the wallpaper had begun to peel away in damp, curling strips. A slow, rhythmic drip, drip, drip had become the new soundtrack to his life, a maddening tick of a clock counting down to his exposure. He closed the bowling alley for the day, citing a fumigation issue. He spent hours in the basement, frantically trying to locate the main water shutoff for that section of the building, but the plumbing was a chaotic, unlabeled maze of pipes that snaked through the foundation like petrified roots. His panic escalated into a frantic, desperate scramble. He tried to patch the wall from the inside of his office, applying spackle over the damp spot, a useless gesture against the persistent seep of water. He knew the source was the old copper pipe that ran through the hidden space, the one he had been so careful not to disturb when he built the room. He had no way to access it without tearing down the wall, and he couldn't do that. By the end of the week, the situation was untenable. The leak had worsened, no longer a seep, but a steady trickle. A shallow pool of water had collected along the baseboard, soaking into the worn office carpet. The smell was no longer musty. It was the foul stench of rot and mildew. He knew, with a sickening certainty, that he had no choice. To ignore it any longer would risk a catastrophic flood, a collapse, something that would expose his secret in the most dramatic way possible. He had to call a plumber. The thought terrified him. A stranger in his office, near the wall. It was a risk of catastrophic proportions. He spent an entire morning hunched over the yellow pages, his gnarled finger tracing the listings. He couldn't call the big, established companies. They were too professional, too thorough. He needed someone small, new, maybe inexperienced. He found a listing for Marco's Plumbing. Fast, fair, and reliable. It was a small ad, a simple name. He sounded young. Perfect. When Marco arrived the next day, Mr. Henderson's heart was a frantic drum against his ribs. The plumber was exactly what he'd feared. Young, yes, but also bright-eyed, professional, and carrying a bag of modern-looking tools. He was competent. "Wow, you've got a pretty serious leak here, Mr. Henderson," Marco said, his eyes immediately going to the ruined wall. "Yes, well, it's an old building," Henderson said, his voice a strained, folksy drawl. He tried to steer the young man toward the small sink in the corner of the office. "I imagine it's just a fitting from this old sink here. Probably an easy fix for a pro like you." Marco gave the sink a cursory glance, then pulled a device from his bag. He pressed the two prongs of the moisture meter against the wall far from the sink. It beeped loudly, its digital screen flashing red. He tested another spot, closer to the main stain. Another loud beep. "No, sir," Marco said politely but firmly. "The source isn't the sink. It's deep inside this wall. The pipe's likely burst. There's no way around it. I'm going to have to open this up to get to it." The blood drained from Henderson's face. "Oh, I don't know about that," he stammered, wringing his hands. "It's an old wall. Probably full of asbestos. It's dangerous. I'll wear a mask," Marco said, already pulling one from his bag. He took out a small, battery-powered drywall saw and a marker. He drew a neat, 2-foot square on the wallpaper over the worst of the water damage. "Don't worry, sir. I'll make a clean cut. We'll have this fixed up in no time." Henderson wanted to scream, to tackle the boy, to throw him out of the building. But he knew any resistance would only look suspicious. He was trapped. He could only stand there, his breath held tight in his chest, and watch as Marco placed the blade of the saw against the wall. The saw buzzed to life, a high-pitched, angry sound that filled the tense silence of the office. It sliced through the drywall with ease. Henderson watched, mesmerized with horror, as the neat square was cut. Marco turned off the saw, set it down, and carefully pulled the piece of damp, ruined drywall away from the wall. He peered into the hole. Henderson's world tilted on its axis. Marco frowned. "That's weird," he said, his voice puzzled. He hadn't found pipes or insulation. He had found another wall, just a few inches behind the first. It was covered in dark, smooth wood paneling. And near the bottom of the paneling, he could see a small, rectangular metal slot, like a mail slot on a door. It made no sense. "Must be an old renovation," Henderson croaked, his voice thin. Marco wasn't listening. He pulled a small, powerful flashlight from his pocket and shone it through the hole he had just cut. The beam illuminated the dark space, catching on the wood paneling. Then, he angled the light downwards, trying to see what was below. The beam passed through the strange metal slot. For a moment, all he saw was darkness. Then the light caught something, a flicker of movement. He adjusted the beam, his curiosity turning to a cold, prickling unease. The light found a small, bare foot, and then a pale, thin leg. He moved the beam upwards. He saw the hem of a simple, gray dress. He saw a small, frail body, huddled in the corner of what looked like a tiny, dark room. He saw a cascade of long, dark, matted hair. And then the figure moved. The head lifted slowly, and in the focused beam of Marco's flashlight, two wide, terrified eyes stared back at him. Time seemed to stop. The buzz of the fluorescent lights in the office, the distant rumble of a bowling ball, the frantic thumping of his own heart. It all faded away for Marco. There was only the image burned into his brain. The pale face, the dark room, the terrified eyes of a girl on the wall. He stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. It clattered to the floor, its beams spinning wildly, casting dancing, monstrous shadows across the office. He looked from the hole in the wall to Mr. Henderson. The old man's folksy, kind facade had crumbled, replaced by a mask of pure, primal terror. Who is that?" Marco stammered, his voice a strangled whisper. Henderson lunged, his age-spotted hands surprisingly strong. He grabbed for Marco's arm. "You saw nothing. It's nothing. It's just old storage." The lunge broke Marco's paralysis. Adrenaline, cold and sharp, flooded his system. He shoved the old man away, sending him staggering back against his desk. Marco scrambled for his phone, his fingers fumbling, slick with a sudden, cold sweat. He punched in 911, his breath coming in ragged gasps. 911, what is your emergency? Henderson's Lanes, Marco choked out, his eyes still locked on the hole in the wall. The bowling alley. There's a girl. My God, there's a girl in the wall. He has a girl trapped in the wall. The dispatcher's calm, professional questions were a lifeline in his sea of panic. He gave the address, his name, what he had found. As he was talking, Henderson let out a low, guttural moan and sank into his office chair, his face in his hands, a broken man. It was over. The police response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 3 minutes, the first patrol car screamed into the parking lot. Officers swarmed the building, their faces grim, their movements efficient and purposeful. They found Marco, pale and shaking, in the hallway, and Mr. Henderson, sobbing uncontrollably in his office chair. A new police chief, a younger, sharper man named Davies who had taken over the department 2 years prior, took command of the scene. He took one look at the hole in the wall, at the hidden room beyond, and then at the weeping old man. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening clarity. He had reviewed all the major cold cases when he took the job. He knew the story. The little girl who vanished from this very building 5 years ago. Get a team with a pry bar and a sledgehammer down here now, he ordered, his voice tight with a controlled fury. And somebody give me the cold case file for Sofia Ramirez. He turned to another officer. Go to Elena Ramirez's house. Now, bring a female officer with you. Handle it gently. The rescue was a slow, delicate, and horrifying procedure. The officers didn't just pry open the hidden door. They took down the entire section of wall, exposing the cell to the light of the office. It was a 10 by 10 foot box, soundproofed and windowless. Inside, the girl, impossibly small and pale for a child of 12, cowered in the corner, her hands over her ears to block out the sudden, violent noise. She was clutching a dirty, one-eyed stuffed bear. A female officer, trained in victim support, entered the room slowly, speaking in a low, soothing voice. The girl didn't respond. She just stared, her eyes, which hadn't seen sunlight in 5 years, wide and unblinking in the harsh fluorescent light. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She was a ghost, a relic from a forgotten tomb. When the officer gently tried to lead her out, the girl resisted, her eyes darting past the uniforms, searching the office for the only face she knew, the only constant in her dark, silent world. She was looking for Mr. Henderson. Meanwhile, a patrol car pulled up to a small, neat house with a fading blue door. An officer, his heart heavy, walked to the door and knocked. It was opened by a woman in her mid-30s, her face etched with a weary caution that had been carved there by years of disappointment. It was Elena. Mrs. Ramirez, the officer began, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't hide. Elena's body tensed. She braced herself for another false lead, another well-meaning but ultimately painful reminder of her loss. Mrs. Ramirez, the officer said again, his voice cracking slightly. We found her. We found Sofia. She's alive. The world tilted. The air left Elena's lungs. The years of grief, of rage, of hollowed-out hope, crested in a single, overwhelming wave. Her legs gave out from under her. She didn't fall. The officer caught her, holding her up as a great, shuddering sob tore through her, the first tear she had shed in years. It was the sound of a stone cracking open. Back at the station, a senior investigator named Marcus Cole, who had been a rookie detective back in 1995, pulled the cold case file for Sofia Ramirez from the archives. He opened the dusty folder and stared at the smiling, 7-year-old face of the missing girl. He remembered the case. He remembered the dismissive attitude of his superiors, the focus on the negligent single mother, the quick and tidy conclusion of a stranger abduction. He looked at the picture, then at the report coming in from the scene. This wasn't a stranger abduction. This was a monster hiding in plain sight, a monster the whole town loved. The confession of Arthur Henderson was not a torrent of guilt, but a quiet, rambling monologue delivered in the sterile, white-walled interrogation room. He spoke not of a crime, but of a misguided act of love. He told the detectives about his own daughter, Emily, who had been killed by a drunk driver 25 years earlier, just a week after her 7th birthday. "She was my whole world," he said, his voice a dry, papery whisper, his eyes fixed on a point in the distant past. When she was gone, the light went out. The world didn't make sense anymore. He had built a room behind his office wall a year after her death. It wasn't a prison, he explained. It was a sanctuary, a place where he could go to feel close to her memory. It was his secret tomb of grief. For years it sat empty. Then he saw Sofia. She looked just like her. He whispered, a tear finally tracing a path down his wrinkled cheek. The same dark hair, the same smile. The same way she held her head when she was happy. It was like God had sent her back to me. A second chance. On that Saturday, his grief-shattered mind concocted a desperate, delusional plan. He saw Elena turn her back at the counter. In that moment, he saw the world as a place of infinite danger, a place that had stolen his daughter and could just as easily steal this one. He had to protect her. He tapped Sofia on the shoulder, smiled his kind, familiar smile, and whispered, "I have a whole case of cherry slushy mix in my office. Want to see?" Sofia, who knew and trusted the nice old man who always gave her candy, nodded happily and took his hand. He led her into the office, locked the door, and opened the wall. He told her it was a magic room, a secret clubhouse. Before she could understand what was happening, he had closed the door, sealing her in darkness. He insisted, with a chilling sincerity, that he had never harmed her. He had brought her food and books. He had been her teacher. He was not a monster. He was her protector. "I saved her," he said, looking Detective Cole in the eye, his expression one of absolute, unshakable conviction. "I kept her safe from the world." The brutal truth of his motive, not malice, but a profound, twisted grief, made the crime even more monstrous. The legal outcome was swift. Faced with the undeniable evidence, Henderson pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole and died of a stroke in the prison infirmary less than a year later, a quiet end to a life of secret horror. For Elena, the true ordeal had just begun. The reunion she had dreamed of for 2,190 days was not a joyful embrace, but a quiet, heartbreaking encounter in a sterile hospital room, mediated by therapists. The girl who sat on the bed was not the vibrant, giggling 7-year-old she had lost. This was a pale, silent 12-year-old, a stranger with Sofia's face. Sofia didn't recognize her. She flinched when Elena tried to touch her hand. She stared at her mother with wide, fearful eyes, the eyes of a wild animal encountering a new species. Her world had been a 10-by-10 room and a man named Mr. Eddie. The sun hurt her eyes, the sound of traffic terrified her, and the open space of a backyard sent her into a panic. And in the quiet moments, she would whisper the same question over and over. "When is Mr. Eddie coming to read to me?" Elena's heart, which she thought had been broken beyond repair 5 years ago, broke all over again. The daughter she had gotten back was a ghost, psychologically tethered to the man who had stolen her. The monster had not just taken her child. He had reshaped her soul. The months that followed were a slow, painful climb out of a deep, dark hole. Henderson's Lanes was condemned and torn down, its neon sign and thunderous echoes erased from the town. Elena quit her job, dedicating every second of her existence to Sofia's recovery. She learned to be patient, to celebrate the smallest victories. The first time Sofia willingly stepped outside. The first time she looked at a photograph of her 7-year-old self without flinching. The first time she allowed Elena to read her a bedtime story. The final scene of their long first chapter of healing took place on a cool summer evening, nearly a year after the rescue. They were sitting on the back porch steps, watching the fireflies begin to blink in the growing dusk. Sofia had been silent for almost an hour, lost in her own world. Elena didn't push. She just sat with her, a quiet, constant presence. Then, without a word, Sofia reached out and slipped her small, pale hand into her mother's. Her grip was light, tentative, but it was there. It was the first time she had initiated physical contact. It was a bridge across an ocean of trauma. Elena looked at her daughter, this precious, wounded ghost who had come home from the grave. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, she felt not the weight of the past, but the fragile possibility of the future. He had stolen her daughter's childhood, buried her in a silent, lonely darkness. But she would spend the rest of her life showing her the light.